Good afternoon, George. I'm Jesse, and welcome to the Ivory Tower Collections game room. Sitting here beside me is one of two Atari 7800 consoles that you sent to me to receive services here at the Ivory Tower. And I am glad to say that both of your Atari 7800 consoles are done. That's right. Project is finished and they are ready to come back home. So let's talk a little bit about your consoles as far as what was done. And we're going to start with the first one I worked on, which is the one that has the dented metal plate here. It's just got a tiny little dent. I believe it also has, yes, it also has the expansion interface on the side. So this console didn't receive as many services or require as many services as the other one. So basically, both consoles, this one included, received complete diagnostics in that I basically have a couple of different diagnostic cartridges and ROM images that I load up into them to verify functionality of the console and just check a few things. This console was 100%. It didn't really need anything, but I went ahead and followed along with what you were wanting me to do. So the capacitors have been replaced, as well as the front panel buttons have been replaced with my Alps branded high quality ones. They're higher quality than the OEM. They're not the premium crazy ones that I have on the other one, but you get the idea. So yes, we have all new front panel switches, new capacitors. The RF modulator has been removed completely from the system, and instead we have one of the UAV and one of my specific UAV mount boards installed that's then providing all of the audio video output that the new UAV board provides through a 10-pin mini DIN in the back of the console. And the reason why we use the 10-pin, which is wired in the fashion of the Sega Saturn console, is because with the 10 pins available, we have the ability to have both the composite as well as the S-video signals and all of the audio signals that we need from a single point. So as a result, this allows us to have a minimal modification offering for the 7800 console to help it retain more of a stock look instead of all of the different multiple RCA and S-video jacks that might normally have been required. Aside from that, there really wasn't much else that needed to be done with this console. So yeah, with that, I'm going to go ahead and change my camera around. We're going to take a look at it in more detail. I will go through the diagnostics routine on it really quickly just to kind of show you what's involved with that. And we'll take a look at a couple of games and we'll go from there. So, George, I'll be right back. George, I now have my camera pointed directly at my LCD screen. I have your first Atari 7800 plugged up and ready to go. Now we are going to start everything off on this in composite video output, just to kind of give us a baseline for comparison. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and power on the 7800 with my diagnostics in place. And again, we are initially looking at this through composite. So here we are. This is the configuration utility. So I'll just kind of go through some of these options really quick. So the first one is the console information. It sees that it is an NTSC 7800. It sees all the available RAM in the system. It also recognizes that it is an NTSC BIOS that's been found. It also sees my Pokey chip that I have on my diagnostic. It has a joystick test, which, just like the name implies, gives us a visual representation of the controllers in operation. I do have two controllers plugged in. It also shows us things like the pause button. You can see that it's actuating over here under the switch B assignment. We also have one for the select and for the reset. Again, all of your front panel buttons have been replaced. One thing I had forgot to mention in the intro video was that this console also had a problem with the difficulty switches. And I am pleased to say that I have rebuilt both switches. There's player 1's difficulty switch showing up over there, and there's player 2. I'm going to show you something a little later on that more visually shows this for us, but I just wanted to let you know that that is indeed working. We'll come back to the color display in a little bit. The internal RAM test, as the name implies, it's just checking all of the internal system RAM in the console and basically just has a real basic zeros and ones test that it uses. It then executes that same test quickly using a mirrored function. So basically it just reverses the position of where the zeros and the ones were, because you might have RAM that might have an issue that has one, or it might have like a zero that's always stuck in a position that just happens to be where it needs to for these tests, and the mirror test would reveal if you had a stuck bit in the memory somewhere. External RAM test is not applicable because that is for use with development cartridges like the programmers might use that has extra RAM on the cartridge. Same thing here with the high score management and the Atari Vox management and the Memory Explorer. I'm not going to go into detail on those because those rely on functionality of a separate device. I will talk about the cartridge integrity test real quick. So this cartridge integrity test is good for two things. First is that it is constantly reading the data from the cartridge and comparing it with what it reads in active memory. So as a result, every time it does a pass and all of that checks out and matches between the two, the cartridge and the console RAM, everything shows up green. So the reason for this test, and the reason why I like to use it, it's also part of my burn-in testing, is because if a console has problems, they may not immediately show up until it's been on for a while. So one of the things I'll do is I'll leave this test running in the background for like maybe an hour or so, and then I'll come back to it. And if everything is still green, like I see here, then I know that there's no problems with the timings and the system and with the cartridge reads and everything like that. Another thing I use this test for is what I call the wiggle test. So it's going to be hard to tell, but I'm literally wiggling my diagnostic cartridge back and forth in the cartridge slot. So this also tells me if we have a good connection with the pins in the cartridge slot with the cartridge, provided everything is clean, of course, and that there's no issues. If there were some read problems, we would see red blocks that might appear. It can even lock up the console sometimes. These white dots down here in the bottom are normal. That is reserved for the system usage, and no data is usually ever able to be written there, so that's completely normal. Okay. That takes us to the audio test. Now the audio test, we are listening for two things. Technically we're listening for three things. The first two things are that it's going to execute an audio test of the TIA chip, so that's the normal two voices that comes out of the TIA for 2600 games and a lot of 7800 games. And it's also going to do the 4 separate voices out of the Pokey chip that I have installed on this cartridge. So games that have Pokey chip enhancement in them, like several homebrews, and games like Ball Blazer or Commando on the 7800, we should also hear sounds. So we want to make sure that we hear a tone as it says it's displaying each voice. So those are the first two things. We want to make sure both chips are playing sound. The second thing, or the third thing I should say that we're listening for, is that the volume between the TIA chip and the Pokey chip should be basically the same, or what they call the amplitude. But we just call it the volume. And that's important because if you have a console that hasn't had the video or the audio portion of it upgraded properly with the rest of the system, then what can happen is the TIA audio may actually overpower the Pokey audio, and it becomes very difficult to hear the Pokey sound. Or in some cases, it can be the reverse, where the Pokey is too loud and the TIA is unable to be heard properly. So this audio test allows us to hear all of that and compare them. So here we go. Awesome. No problems, and everything sounded great. That takes us to the color display test. So here is the color display test. And again, we are initially viewing this on composite, and it looks pretty good, admittedly. We've got lots of colors are being shown here, but there are a couple of things I want to point out. My camera may or may not show this. So for starters, all of the text that's in white up here, like where it says color display, match, color, there's a little bit of bleeding off to the side. I see a little bit of like a green and a blue off to the left and right of each of the letters. Also, there's a little bit of that same kind of bleeding that takes effect on each of these color squares. And this is completely normal. That's because a composite signal, as the name implies, is a combination of all of the colors plus the sync signals and everything that a television would need to be able to display an image. But because they are combined the way they are, it's not a very clean signal. And you start to have what they call you start to have bleed over into those signals, or what they call crosstalk between them. So that's what results in some of the bleeding colors that we see on the text. Something else I want you to see is down here we have this color bar down here that says match color. And again, I haven't changed any of the colors on these consoles. I left them as they were. But this will vary from console to console. It will also change depending on how long the console's been on, and that these two halves will sometimes align and sometimes they won't. Something else I want you to look at is right here. You see how we have this green and we have like this kind of a light blue or a lavender color in these two squares. We also have these little stripes over here, which I'm not sure if my camera will pick it up, but this is like an emerald green in between the white, and this is like a burgundy or almost like a really deep purple in between the white stripes there. Well, that line is what we call artifact colors. Basically, these colors on this line, on this section here, don't actually exist. What's happening is, because of the proximity of the programming between the various white stripes in all of these bars, or in all of these sections, causes the TV to interpret them as being a color. And this was used in a couple of games to provide additional color where it may not have normally been possible. One game that relies solely on this artifacting effect is the game Tower Toppler. Ricky and Vicky also uses it to some degree, but it's not as critical with that game as it is with Tower Toppler. But watch what happens when I switch the console into S-Video. All of that goes away. So now the text is super sharp. We don't have any more of that bleeding taking effect at all. Same thing with all of these colored squares. Some of the squares down here on the very, very bottom row still look a little fuzzy and have a little bit of bleeding, but that's just an inherent issue with the hardware of the console itself. The Maria chip just kind of produces that to some degree. My chroma timing fix on my mount boards fixes this largely because these blurring squares used to occur almost halfway up. But notice now that line down here at the bottom, we don't have those colors anymore. You can actually see the individual stripes that actually make up the graphics. And again, that's because S-Video and RGB and other higher video quality sources do not support artifacting. So any games that rely on it may look a little odd when viewed through S-Video. And that's the 7800 diagnostic. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to my 2600 diagnostic really quick that I use because it shows us a little visually a couple of things and also is better demonstration of the difficulty switches. So let me switch over to that now. Okay, here we are looking at my 2600 diagnostic test cartridge. And basically, you know, it just has this one static screen that comes up for the most part. But it does show me graphically that the controllers are working. Not that this is any surprise. We saw this previously in the 7800 test as well. But here's what I do want you to see. If you take a look at this section here, this is where it breaks down the individual switch functions that we can see a little better. So as an example, the pause button is both the color and black and white switch on the 2600. So you can see that as I depress the pause button, that's working properly. Also, when I use select, you'll see that it switches from 0 to 1, and the reset switches from 0 to 1. And then most importantly is the difficulty switches. So right now, this is difficulty left, difficulty right. You can see that they are both in the B position. Now let me switch them. And you can see that they switch just fine. They work great. The other thing that this test allows me to do, and it's the reason why I mainly use this one in 7800 consoles, is you'll notice that we have these little bars down here, these 4 different colored bars, like this orange, this brown, this green, and this yellow. Well, what are those all about? Well, those are actually paddle lines. And the reason for them is so you can test and verify paddle functionality, because it is possible to have a console that looks like it's working, but in reality you find out that the paddles may not be functioning. So this is the player 1 paddle control, and my paddles are a little jittery. I don't really care. I don't play many paddle games, and I mainly just use these paddles to test that the paddle functionality is working. And then here is player 2. Now, it's possible, I was stating, to have a console that looks like it's working, but the paddles may not be working, and that's because the paddles are controlled 100% by the TIA chip, and it's just a specific section of the TIA chip. So it is possible to have a problem with the console not reading paddle games, and you might not even realize it until you try to use them. So I do check and verify that the paddles are working. So there's player 4, and there's player 3. So yeah, the paddle controls are working 100%. All right, let's take a look at some games. I'm going to pretty much be using my backbit cartridge for almost everything that you're about to see because it works for what I need it to, and it's got everything loaded on it that I need. So here we go. And we are in composite right now. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go and I want to show you some demonstrations real quick on composite and S-Video. So I'm going to actually use the game Pitfall as my beginning test on this. So here we are, we're looking at the game Pitfall. Now it looks pretty good. This is in composite. But there are a few things that you may or may not be able to see because my camera may or may not pick them up. One is the score and the timer up here, the digits. They look good. I can tell that that says 2000 and that says 20 minutes. But if I look really closely, I can see what looks like some little dashes or some vertical lines that kind of go through it. Also, if we take a look at Pitfall Harry, especially in the front of his face, there's some bleeding going on there. And we can also see a little bit of it like on the ladders, the log. But take a look at the bricks down here on the bottom in the subterranean section. And you'll see that we have some more vertical stripes going through the bricks, at least through the mortar section. Well, let's take a look at what that looks like under S-Video. It's like night and day, it really is. So for starters, all of the text and the score and the timer is crystal sharp now. We don't have any more of those vertical stripes that I had before. If we take a look at Pitfall Harry, he's much more clear now, with hardly any to almost no bleed at all coming off of him. Same thing with the ladder, the log looks good, and look at the bricks. Yeah, so the bricks now show a solid gray line to represent the mortar between them, and we don't have any of those dashes anymore. So yeah, kind of a cool little thing. Let's take a look at another game real quick to show you the difference between the composite and the S-Video output. So another excellent game to use for this is Shooting Gallery. It's a magic game, but similar to what we saw with Pitfall, I want to show you a couple of things on the composite output. I mean, again, lots of color. We don't have any interference. It looks very good, but there are a few things to point out. For one, if we look at the platform that the snail's running back and forth on, we can see that, again, we have those little vertical stripes. Looks like he's running along a serrated edge of a knife or something on that platform. We can see it again here into this light blue, into like a lavender type color here before it hits the screen. There's another bit of it up here. But then take a look at the clock. So if you take a look at the clock face and you take a look between where the roof of the clock is and the actual clock face, you'll see that we have, again, these little, almost like a little checkerboard dots going on in between it. As I'm sure you're about to realize, those objects aren't actually the graphics. Here it is in S-Video. Much sharper, much clearer. Now we can clearly see the platform the snail's running back and forth on, that nice brown colored line. There's no more of those broken up dots. We have nice color gradients between this light blue to that lavender section. Same thing with this kind of like a olive green to almost like a teal. And then look at the clock. So between the tower, or between the roof of the clock and the clock face, that was in fact a solid blue line in between them. But again, you couldn't really see that before under composite. But with S-Video and with a good scaler, it's not a problem at all. And George, that takes us to the second Atari 7800, and this is the one that you specified you wanted it to receive the works. And that is exactly what has been provided at this point. So, same thing as before, I did a complete diagnostic on it and didn't really find anything wrong with it at first. As you know, we had some challenges with this console that I discovered after we had the UAV in place and had better audio-video output capability with it, that I then discovered a minor issue with it. So let's talk about what's been done on this console. So same as before, all of the capacitors were replaced in it, just like the other console. It also has all new front panel switches on it, only now it's got my higher quality Alps switches. They're same brand, but they look a little bit different. They have a little wider actuator on top of them as far as, you know, being able to push down on them. And they're just generally a higher, even higher quality switch. Additionally, just like the other console, the RF modulator was removed, the UAV and the UAV mount board setup was installed, also providing us with the 10-pin output on the back, just like the other console. One other addition that was made on this one that you have requested was that you wanted the audio input option added. So this is the first time I've done it this way. It actually turned out pretty well. I'd like to try to find some other ways to maybe do it a little bit easier, but you've got a 3.5mm audio jack in place of where the channel select switch used to be. That allows me to have both the 10-pin for all of your audio output as well as the new audio input without having to do much case modification shell work at all. So it still retains a pretty stock look overall. In addition, you had requested the power LED to be swapped out. So this one has one of my cyan colored LEDs. So it's not quite blue, it's not quite white, you know, it's a little bit of the mix in between. I know you'd wanted teal, and I'm going to look into that to see if that might be a color option. I don't think I've seen that specifically, but I definitely like these cyan LEDs, and there's not too many other consoles that have this particular color that I've installed, but it's a pretty cool color. A couple of other changes that were made on this console is that you requested that the original voltage regulation system be replaced with one of my DC-DC switching converter setups. Now, what this is it's a single part drop-in replacement that uses fast switching technology to provide the regulated power to the rest of the system, versus the old linear regulators, which basically would take the excess voltage and give it off as heat, hence why they had to be attached to heat sinks. Well, with the new DC-DC switching regulator, it accomplishes two things. It removes almost all of that heat that would have been generated because it doesn't need a heatsink at all. In fact, the heatsink's been removed from this console. Second thing is, because of the way it works with its fast switching technology, it actually allows the console to operate much more efficiently as far as power is consumed. Now, when we're talking about something like an Atari console, it's not going to be like drastic savings, you know, in your energy bill or anything necessarily like that. But one advantage is that with the switching regulator in place, the console only requires about half as much power to operate as it normally would draw or take in with the old regulation system. So again, it's pretty cool. Another thing I did was on this particular console, because the original resistors were reading a little low, I went ahead and replaced out both of the trigger resistors mainly used for the fire buttons in 7800 mode and a little bit in 2600 mode with some brand new ones. When those resistors start to get too far out of spec or start to drift, as we call it, then the TIA gets confused on the fire buttons being pressed or not. And what can happen is it can cause ghost fire button presses to occur. So it's not something that I was exhibiting with your console, but because they were reading a little low for what I would like, I went ahead and changed them out anyway. It's to have the new kiloparsec BIOS installed. Now, what that BIOS affords, or what it provides you, is a couple of just kind of cool things and some other quality of life improvements that you wouldn't necessarily notice immediately. So for starters, one of the things it does is it bypasses the encryption check that 7800 NTSC games required. So as a result, you now have the ability to play PAL 7800 games and demos on your console. Now, I want to warn you, even though the console will allow those ROMs to load up and play, or those cartridges if you try to use them, there's going to be some issues because there's still some differences inside the consoles internally between the PAL signal format and the NTSC format. So even though they'll load up and they might potentially run, they're going to have some graphical glitches, or they might run really slow, or they might even just flat out lock out. So it might be, you know, you might think, well, what's the purpose in that? Well, it has to do with the demos. So if you have a decent flash cartridge, you know, like the 7800 GD, for instance, the 7800 game drive, then quite a few of the demos that came out for the 7800, just like graphic demos, audio demos, things like that, do require the use of a PAL console, or they were coded with a PAL console, and as a result, they don't have the key check that the normal BIOS would check to verify if the game is good or not. So it allows you to get around that. The other thing it does is it has a new graphical loader screen. So I'm sure you're used to seeing the traditional little rainbow stripes and the Atari Fuji logo at the top when a 7800 game starts up. That has been replaced with a new version of the logo that is both, I consider, modern looking and still retains the retroness of the console. It's pretty slick. I like it a lot. And then it also has a built-in game. That game is called Kiloparsec, which hence is the name. And it is a game that was programmed by Bob Te Crescenzo, which you also know as possibly as Pac-Man Plus on the Atari Age forums. He's programmed a lot of 7800 games. Pretty much all of the homebrew Pac-Man related games that have been released over the last 10 years plus, those are Bob's creations. So he created this little simple arcade game that's built into the machine to be able to play it. And to access it's very simple. You just have to power the console on without a game inserted, and Kiloparsec will come up by default. If you have a game inserted, the BIOS recognizes that and it will load up whatever the cartridge is that you have installed. 2600, 7800 games, they all work the same as they did before. Another thing that this BIOS has, and this is more of a quality of life improvement, but not something that you would immediately notice, is that it is supposed to help improve compatibility with some 2600 homebrews that might be a little finicky on certain Atari 7800 consoles. Oh, before I forget, I want to mention the functionality of the audio input really quickly. So I mainly designed it for use with this little guy here called the Atari Vox. And this is specifically an Atari Vox Plus. And what this does, as the name would imply, is you plug it into controller port 2 on either a 2600 or an Atari 7800, and games that support it will provide speech output from this device that works with the game. It also acts as a high score save device. So certain games that have been coded to support the Atari Vox for saving high scores, or if those games have been coded to use what's called a save key for high scores, they're compatible with the Atari Vox as well. However, the one thing with the Atari Vox is, even though it's providing speech capability, it does so through a separate speaker output here. Normally what you would have to do when you plugged it into the console is you would either have to plug in a set of external speakers, or you would have to incorporate some sort of an external mixer that allowed you to combine the two audio sources together and then hear everything at once. So I came up with a way to easily mix the audio properly within the console itself, and that's how this works. So now you would plug in your Atari Vox into controller port 2 on the 7800. Now because of the lip of the console in the front, the Atari Vox doesn't fit normally. So in the case of the demonstration today, I'm going to be using this extension cable here that I have. And then what you do is, where you would normally plug speakers in, you'll get you a set of like 3.5 inch to 3.5 inch audio cable, like this. You'd plug one side in to the Atari Vox's output, and then the other side would plug into the new audio input jack on the back of the Atari. And now what will happen is whenever you play games that support speech with the Atari Vox, you'll automatically hear the audio from it being mixed within the console itself, and then all of the audio from both the Atari and the Atari Vox coming out to both channels at the same time through your AV receiver or your television. And then that takes us to the last item of discussion with your console, and that was that there was one component that I had to replace. Now, I want to be upfront that the original part was technically working and looked fine, with the exception of some weird graphical anomalies that I saw on the far left and right side images of the screen. You've seen screenshots that I took, as well as you've seen pictures that I took that shows this in detail. And I honestly hadn't encountered it before with a 7800 console. And you have to realize at this point, I've done probably like almost 150 Atari 7800 consoles now over the past 6 years, I guess it has been. Pretty close. And I had never seen this. So it was only doing it with 7800 games, so 2600 games were fine. It wasn't something that exhibited a problem there. And of course, for the most part, it didn't affect any of the gameplay sections themselves. It was just something that I happened to notice when I first powered it on because it wasn't normal to me. And again, I've seen a lot of these consoles to know when something stands out. And as my guess was correct, it ended up being the Maria IC, which is the largest IC in the 7800 and is basically the graphics processor for Atari 7800 games in the Atari 7800 console. Went ahead and replaced it all out and got it in place, and that took care of the issue. You've already seen some teaser video I took from my phone yesterday afternoon when I had it back up and running that shows this. Now, every one of the consoles, both of the consoles are going to come back with a baggie that's going to have all of the old parts that were removed or replaced. So as an example, this bigger bag here is the one for this console because it also has the original Maria IC chip in it. Also, the RF modulators are coming back as well. So that's that one. And then the one for the previous console, again, doesn't have as many parts that had to be removed, but it is also there. There we go. That's all of that information in place. I do apologize, but again, there was a lot of work done on this console. So from here, we are once again going to turn the camera around, point it at my LCD, go through the diagnostics real quick, and just kind of demonstrate the different features, such as the kiloparsec BIOS and the audio input, so that you can check it out and see how it works. Be right back. Okay, George, I have my camera once again pointed at the screen. I have your second 7800, the one that has the works installed. And again, just like the other console, we're going to start with composite initially, and we're going to go straight into the 7800 diagnostics utility. Now, because this one has the modified BIOS in it, that's part of the new startup screen that you just saw. Okay, so here we are looking at the information just like before. Console information, it shows 16K BIOS, 4K BIOS information. Now notice on this one it says unknown BIOS found, and that's because this one has the kiloparsec BIOS in it, so it doesn't really know what it is or how to identify it. Hopefully the creator of this utility will get around to fixing that in the future, especially since he helped make the new BIOS. Similar to the other one, here's the joystick test. Again, no problems here. I do have two controllers plugged in. We have all your new buttons, so there's the pause functionality over there. And then we have the select button and the reset showing up. And then both of the difficulty switches are working as well. You can see that down here. Here's the color display test. Once again, this is the console through composite. Through S-Video, it is much sharper, much clearer. Internal RAM test passes just fine, no issues here. The external RAM test, again, is not applicable. We'll come to the audio test here in just a second. Again, these other tests really aren't applicable for what we need to test here either. Here's the cartridge integrity test, or what I also call the wiggle wiggle test, which is exactly what it sounds like. So yeah, wiggling the cartridge, no problems there, no problems with the reads, everything is good. And then here we go into the audio test. And again, we are listening for the TIA audio, which will play first, and then the 4 voices for the Pokey that comes through on my diagnostic cartridge, and everything should sound roughly the same in volume and balance. Here we go. So again, no issues, everything working great. Let's take a look at the diagnostics for the 2600 side real quick. Okay, and here we are on the diagnostics. Turn the volume down. Here we are, my diagnostics that I use for the 2600 side of things. And again, this is through composite, but again, we can see that the controllers are working just fine. I mean, we already knew that previously. But this is also another good test to be able, again, to see that the difficulty switches are working well. So right now it sees them in position A, there it is in position B for player 1, and then there it is for player 2. And then also the pause button in this case works to show up as color black and white once again. Select, no problem. Reset is no problem as well. Let me go ahead and quickly disconnect these controllers and I will show you the paddle functions. Okay. I've now got a paddle plugged into port 1, so there's player 1, and the fire button registers properly. Here's paddle player 2. Again, my paddles are jittery, but I just need to make sure that the paddle lines are reading. So no problems there for player 1 and 2 on paddles. Let's go ahead and plug into the other port. There's player 3 and player 4. So yeah, no problems there. Paddle reads are good. So everything with this console, as far as functionality goes, checks out just fine. Okay, now what I want to go into is I want to talk about the kiloparsec BIOS that you have installed in your console. So again, the way this works is it will automatically load up the game kiloparsec if you do not have a game installed whenever you first turn on the system. So let me just show you what that's like right now. And there we are, kiloparsec. So Bob has programmed a number of different functions. So again, it can be played with up to 2 players. You can specify the difficulty between easy, normal, and hard. You can specify the starting lives between 3 and 5. And then you can specify if you want rapid fire to be on or off. This is a pretty simple little arcade game, and it's called kiloparsec because it's actually using the character sprites from the TI-99 game called Parsec. So we'll just go ahead and start a button to start the game. Now the game might look easy upon first glance. You know, you've only got these ships coming after you basically one at a time. And that's kind of true, but then as you progress a little further on, the ships will start to approach from different angles, like they might come from behind you. And if you miss the ships, like for instance, I'll miss this green one on purpose, then you'll see that you have the red one and the green one both coming out. And because the red one escaped, he might have another one after him, but he doesn't in this case, and you'll see why, because it will go to a different enemy type. And I believe these enemies come from behind. Oh, nope. They come from in front, but now they drop little mines in the way and they shoot back. And that's basically kiloparsec. So again, it's just a simple little fun little arcade game to try out and to see how far you can get within the level. So if you have a 7800 game that you want to load up, most of the time you're going to see that graphical loader boot right up, as you would expect. However, you don't have to. If you want to go straight to a game, then if you hold down the pause button while powering on the console, it will skip right to it. Let me demonstrate this now using the game Dungeon Stalker. So first I'm going to boot it up normally, so there's the Atari 7800 graphic loader, and then it's going to start to load up Dungeon Stalker. Okay, so now I'm going to hold down the pause button as I power on the console, and it goes straight to Dungeon Stalker. It completely bypasses. So, you know, if you're in a hurry or if you don't like the graphical logo, if it just kind of, you know, just bothers you sometimes to see it each time, you can hold down the pause button to skip it and go right to the game. And there we are. Another cool thing about Dungeon Stalker, and the reason why I'm loading it up specifically, is because I can show you the speech. Because Dungeon Stalker supports the Atari Vox for both high scores and for speech. So again, I am plugging in a extension cable into my Atari Vox and getting everything plugged up here. Now, you're going to hear the Atari Vox initialize as soon as I power on the console.
Atari Vox.
And again, this game supports speech.
Enter in the dungeon. And no retard. please stand or recharge.
Another game that demonstrates the speech options really well is Juno First for the 2600. This is an awesome homebrew.
Juno First. Wave 1. Hyper Space. Wave 2. You're done.
Well, George, there you go. There's your Atari 7800s. I hope you're pleased with the work that's been provided and has been done on the consoles. I'm hopeful that they will last you for many more years to come and ready to be enjoyed. So what is the plan from here? Well, it is currently Sunday afternoon, and my plan is I've got a bigger box already prepared for both consoles. Although the box you used, they were okay, they did arrive intact. I'll be honest, I usually prefer a lot more packing or padding around the consoles, especially in the case of the 7800 when I send them back, because they are pretty brittle. Especially in the case of the 7800s, the plastics just seem to be, well, yeah. So I do have a slightly bigger box, so I'm going to get them wrapped up and get them ready to send back and headed your way. Now, we've already talked a little bit online, so I do have your address information, so I'll go ahead and just send it the same way. And I will also use UPS. Again, that was how you sent it to me, so I will send it back the same way. In addition, I will also be sending you an email that will have a link to this video that you're watching right now. This video will initially be, it will be an unlisted video on my YouTube channel. That's really just for the privacy of my clients. Having said that, you're free to share the URL with anyone you want, because after all, this is your project. These are your consoles. So it is indeed your video. I will also be providing you in that email all of the pictures that I've taken of the consoles. Now, if you have any limitations with your email provider, which I do sometimes run into, then I might send the email as two separate emails. I'll have one that'll have the pictures of one console, and then I'll have another one of the other console. And the pictures are really just to provide you with an inside look so that you can see the work that's been done and been carried out, because it's not something that you would normally see. You just see what it looks like on the outside and how it works. But I think all of my clients deserve to see exactly what the inside of their consoles look like. I also do it for reference because sometimes it's handy for me in the future if there's a question or something like that that comes up then I have the pictures I can go back to refer and see the exact details of what may have been done or exactly what the inside of that console looks like and what it has. After that, I will then get these boxes ready. I will get the box ready to be shipped back out and headed your way, and I will go ahead and mail it back out. When I've done that, I will send you another email that will have the tracking information along with the final invoice with any remaining amount owed. I know that you've already paid quite a bit towards this project, which I greatly appreciate that. Thank you. And we'll go from there. So, George, thank you again, and I really appreciate your patience and having to wait for me to have to wait on parts to come in so I could finish the job. I try to strive for a 2-week turnaround on almost every project that I can do. Sometimes things come up and I'm not able to meet those requirements. But hopefully it's not too much of a delay here in this case, and again, hopefully you're really pleased with the outcome and with the status of everything. So I thank you again. I hope you have a good rest of your weekend, and I'll catch you another time. Thanks.